Today, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to get into the weeds and really break down the step-by-step logic of one of the most dense and influential chapters in ancient literature, Romans, chapter 1. Now, the goal here isn't to preach, but to really trace the argument the author is building, piece by piece. So let's get started.
The whole thing kicks off with this really powerful, straight-to-the-point statement in verse 18. This is the thesis for everything that's about to follow. It introduces this idea of divine wrath, but it's not random. It's a direct response to a very specific human action, suppressing or holding down the truth. This is our ground zero.
So here's our roadmap for unpacking this. We'll follow the author's own logic. We're going to start with how this wrath is revealed, then look at what the text calls the root cause, rejecting truth. After that, we'll see this key consequence, a divine giving over. And then we'll dive into the list of behaviors that follow and wrap up with the author's final point about knowing the judgment all along.
All right, so first up, the core premise. The author doesn't just say, God's wrath is here. He immediately gets into the why. And the entire foundation of his argument hinges on this one idea, that knowledge of God is something everyone has access to.
According to verse 19, this isn't some kind of secret, hidden knowledge. The author is basically saying that what you can know about God is manifest in them. It's plain to see, right inside of people, because God himself has made it plain. That's the first critical piece of this logical puzzle.
Okay, so if this knowledge of God is so obvious, what's the problem? Well, the text immediately pivots from the existence of this knowledge to its active rejection. And for the author, this is the absolute root cause of everything that goes wrong. And it gets deeper. The author expands on this in verse 20, arguing that this knowledge isn't just internal, it's all around us. The created world itself is like this constant visible proof of God's invisible qualities, specifically his eternal power and Godhead. And the conclusion the text draws from this is pretty stark. Humanity is left without excuse.
And right here in verse 21, you see the central conflict laid out perfectly. It draws this sharp line between what people knew and what they did. The text says flat out, they knew God. But the action that should have followed wasn't there. Instead, it says, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful. This gap, this disconnect between knowledge and action is the hinge that the whole argument swings on.
Not acting on what you know, well, that has consequences. And verses 22 and 23 spell them out. It's this progression from ingratitude to a kind of spiritual and intellectual blindness. Their foolish heart was darkened, and that leads directly to idolatry, trading the glory of the Creator for images of created things.
This brings us to a really crucial turning point in the chapter's argument. How does God respond to all this? The text introduces this recurring and honestly kind of chilling concept, a divine giving over.
You can really map it out like a clear downward spiral. It's a chain reaction. You start with this inherent knowledge of God. That knowledge gets ignored, which leads to idolatry. And then, the divine response isn't some thunderbolt from the sky, but something more passive. God simply steps back. He gave them up. And this isn't just a throwaway line. The author repeats it on purpose. 3 times in verses 24, 26, and 28, we see this exact phrase. It totally reframes the consequences. The moral decay isn't a punishment that God actively inflicts. Instead, it's presented as God allowing people to fully experience the results of the path they already chose. It's like the judgment is simply removing the restraints. Okay, so what does that actually look like? After God gives them over, the author unleashes this incredibly detailed inventory of the human condition, a whole catalog of unrighteousness that he argues flows directly from that very first decision to reject the truth. Before we jump into the list, we have to talk about this key phrase from verse 28, a reprobate mind. Now, it sounds really old-fashioned, right? But in the original language, it has this idea of something being tested and failing, being found worthless, like a counterfeit coin. It's describing a mind that's become corrupt, one that's no longer able to tell right from wrong. And from that reprobate mind, wow, the author just unleashes this flood of descriptions in verses 29 through 31. It's this incredibly comprehensive list, right? It covers everything from our internal attitudes like envy and pride to social actions like murder and deceit, and even the breakdown of relationships like being disobedient to parents or breaking promises. The text presents this not as just a random list of bad things, but as the natural fruit of a mind that's been disconnected from its source. But hang on, the argument doesn't stop there. The author adds one final and pretty devastating layer. He tackles the big question of ignorance.
Are people doing all these things just because they don't know any better?
The very last verse, verse 32, is the capstone of this whole argument. The author makes this incredible claim that people inherently know the judgment of God. They know that these actions deserve a severe consequence. But despite knowing this, they not only do them anyway, they also approve of and even take pleasure in others who do the same.
And that's where the text leaves us, with this really provocative conclusion. I mean, it's one thing to do something you know is wrong. It's another thing entirely to applaud others for doing it too. So what does this final claim, that knowledge of right and wrong exists right alongside the celebration of wrong, really suggest about the author's view of the human condition? It's a huge question that sits at the very heart of this ancient and incredibly complex argument.